Welcome to all, and thank you so much for joining us for the Legal State of the Nation. This is the second installment of our virtual Michigan and Manhattan event series. And we're so glad that you could join us today, whether you're in the tri-state, covered in snow, or maybe tuning in from someplace a little bit warmer today. My name is Jessica Evans. I serve as the Director of Major Gifts in the Tri-State region for the University of Michigan. I'm joined today by my tri-state colleagues, Ann Orloff, Sarah Michaels, and Annie Bell. And we just want to thank you for taking an hour from your day to be with us and our wonderful, fantastic guest speaker, Barb McQuade. Before I introduce our host for today, let me just share a few housekeeping notes. We will have ample time set aside for Q&A, and we encourage you to ask questions for the Q&A portion of the event today. So to do so, please just type your question in the Q&A window at any time. The chat function is also available for comments or if you need technical support. So now I'm honored and delighted to introduce Heather Dietrick, our host and co-moderator for today's event. Heather serves as CEO of The Daily Beast. Previously, she was president of Gizmodo Media Group, leading day-to-day operations and driving strategic integration into its acquiring entity, Univision Communications. Before this position, she was president and general counsel of Gawker Media, where she also served on the board of directors, providing strategic advice to steer the company towards a successful asset sale. Before joining Gawker, Heather worked as a First Amendment fellow and counsel at Hearst Corporation, as a law clerk in the Eastern District of New York, and as an associate at Goodwin Procter LLP, where she practiced trademark and patent litigation and prosecution. Heather was previously co-chair of the American Bar Association Forum on Communications Law. She holds a BA from Georgetown University and a JD and an MBA from the University of Michigan. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll hand it over to you to say a few words and introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I am really thrilled to be here, and thank everyone who logged on and hopefully has power after that doozy of a storm on the East Coast. It's my true honor today to introduce Professor Barb McQuade, who is our main speaker. From 2010 to 2017, Professor McQuade served as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. She was appointed to that position by President Barack Obama, and she was the first woman to serve in her position. Professor McQuade also served as vice chair of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee and co-chaired its Terrorism and National Security Subcommittee. As U.S. Attorney, she oversaw cases involving public corruption, terrorism, corporate fraud, theft of trade secrets, civil rights, and healthcare fraud, among many others. And before becoming U.S. Attorney, Professor McQuade served as an assistant U.S. Attorney in Detroit for 12 years, serving as Deputy Chief of the National Security Unit, where she handled cases involving terrorism financing, export violations, threats, and foreign agents. Professor McQuade began her career as a law clerk for the U.S. District Judge Bernard A. Friedman in Detroit, and then practiced at the law firm of Boots Long in Detroit. She previously taught at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law, and of course is a current professor at the University of Michigan School of Law. And she has also been recognized by many prominent organizations for her work, including the Detroit News and with the Michiganian of the Year Award, Crane's Detroit Business as Newsmaker of the Year, an award that's very interesting to me, and one of Detroit's most influential women. So it is truly my honor to introduce Professor McQuade and ask her to take it away with her opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Heather. Great to have you here, Jessica. Thank you. I have great regard for the Daily Beast. You folks have run my op-eds from time to time, but I love to read it to get different perspectives on things. And I really find it an exciting time in media and journalism with all of the different options that we have out there. So thanks for the work that you do at the Daily Beast. Well, welcome to all of our friends from New York, Michigan, in Manhattan. It's one of the rare days when the weather in New York is worse than the weather in Michigan. The sun is shining here, but I don't think we have quite so much snow on the ground as you folks do, but I hope you're enjoying it. I always love a good snowy day. I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas And then what I really want to do is engage with you and talk with you about what's on your mind, and answer your questions and have a conversation. We have about 150 people on, but in the world of Zoom, that gives us all the opportunity to ask questions. And so we'll do that in a little bit. But I want to talk a little bit just about the state of the law in our country. And I had the opportunity to serve on the Biden transition. Certainly I'm not going to talk about any details about that process, but one just big observation that I had in that process that I think will be reassuring to all of you is that our work there was really all about good government. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about any political agenda. It was all very much about using government to solve problems, making sure the trains run on time. How are we dealing with COVID to treat people in our society and as a workplace in the federal government? What kind of resources do we have and need to make sure people are able to keep up with technology? What are the hiring needs to fill key vacancies? How can we promote diversity within the federal government? So really all just good government things that I think would be reassuring. And I think one of the things that I have found most troubling about the past 4 years is this real sense of the politicization of everything. We think of, as lawyers, I think we think of judges as being independent arbiters and administrators of the rule of law. And I think one of the real harms that we've seen is this idea that judges are either Democrats or Republicans, referring to judges as Obama judges or Trump judges or Clinton judges or Bush judges, I think is really harmful. We have to think of judges as independent, as US judges, as judges of the state of Michigan or of the state of New York, representing the people. The oath they take is to uphold the Constitution and the laws, not any particular political party. And, certainly judges are going to reflect the worldview, I think, oftentimes of the party of the president or governor who appointed them. They are still trying to just get it right. And it's probably no surprise that oftentimes judges rule consistently with the view of the party that appointed them. But I think they are looking at the facts and law and making decisions as they see fit, even though they may reflect that worldview, which is why we sometimes see 5-4 court decisions. Maybe now we'll see more 6-3 court decisions. But it also means that from time to time, you get something like Chief Justice Roberts ruling to uphold the Affordable Care Act. And I think that when we see criticism of him based on his decision that he is somehow deemed a traitor to his party when that happens, I think demonstrates a complete misunderstanding about how the rule of law is supposed to work. And so I'm hopeful that we will see less of this focus on us versus them, this oversimplification of dividing the world into two teams, and instead understanding that the world is all about nuance. I think most of you probably learned in law school, as I did, that the devil is in the details. And I'm sure in your practice, you see that. It is overly simplistic to divide the world into Democrat and Republican, red versus blue, conservative versus liberal, rural versus urban. There is black and white, but there are so many more shades of gray. And I think that is something that has been lost in the past 4 years. I think social media contributes to that. I think the more specialized cable television channels contribute to that. We all listen to our own echo chambers, and we are not subjected enough to the nuances and all of those shades of gray. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of those shades of gray and a few issues that are among the most urgent of our time as it relates to the law. And I ask you to think about the world, not just as either or and binary choices, but our world offers a buffet of unlimited choices. And I think we should think of issues like that. Just because you are pro-choice does not mean you should also be favor gun control, right? Can't you have various views on those things? And it's often surprising to me how all of those views line up depending on whether people identify as Republican or Democrat. And I think that the answers lie in nuance. So for example, one of the things I wanted to talk about is the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that we can support police and law enforcement and the rule of law, and also support the value of Black lives and recognize that we have a problem of racism in law enforcement. That doesn't mean police officers are individually racist. You'll often hear police officers say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, which is a phrase that often irks me. It's not about you. It's about the system. It's about a system that was founded on, fugitive slave bounty hunters. We have seen the use of police to enforce unfair laws. We have seen disparate impacts on community, even if there is not an intent or a purpose to discriminate against certain groups. We can certainly recognize that there is a disparate impact on a society when we have a far larger proportional rate of incarceration of people of color. And I think that should bother all of us, that we have a society that works that way. It's not that police officers, I don't think, are going out of their way to arrest people of color, but I do think that we have crime problems in communities of color that we need to address through investment, education, empowerment, employment, and a number of other things. And there certainly are implicit biases that exist that result in these statistics that say twice as many Black suspects who are unarmed will be killed by police officers in America. And so I think that analysis requires nuance. We have seen 4 years of a president who has tried to push us into one group or another, I believe, as a political wedge to enhance his own political standing, trying to paint one party as being that as lawless and not favoring law and order. I think that if we want to peel away some of the layers, we need to understand that there are ways to address inequitable policing while still supporting police officers. I don't want to live in a world without police. I think the rule of law and the enforcement of the law is what protects the weak from those who would abuse their power, including physical power. As someone who is deceptively weak, I think I would not fare well in a society that didn't have police. We need police and the rule of law to protect us from those who are physically powerful, those who are politically powerful, those who are financially powerful. The majority would crush minority groups if we didn't have the rule of law. But can we do better? Absolutely. And so I think let's not be betrayed by these false choices that you have to have one or another. I think another place where we have seen a lack of nuance has come in the appreciation of ways that leaders are dealing with COVID-19 and shutdown orders. Certainly it has been very harmful to school children and business owners to shut down during COVID-19. On the other hand, those of you in New York are probably among those who have seen most acutely the ravages of COVID-19 and why we can't just blithely walk around without masks and in groups, and that we need to socially distance. But here in Michigan, we have seen these protest groups protest at our Capitol to liberate Michigan, to defy masking orders, to claim that COVID-19 is a hoax. Barbers who've defied orders to open their shops, restaurants who've defied orders. Surely there is room for nuance here. Are the ways that we can do things while respecting people's civil liberties and freedoms, but also protecting the loss of life in a short-term way through short-term orders. And making it a political issue has, I think, been very harmful to the people of our state. No doubt our governor, who has had some of the most aggressive lockdown orders in the country, does not want to hinder our economy. When she faces re-election, economic strength is going to be a big factor that people look at. And yet there are those who have accused her of shutting down businesses and schools in our state to hamper business. I don't think that is likely to be part of her agenda. But certainly reasonable minds can disagree about what is the right balance. I have favored, shutting down schools and businesses in an effort to keep us safe. But I can also see now the harm it is having on my own children who have been isolated for now many, many months and are really seeing some of the harms of that. Are there ways that we can be careful, but also allow kids to go to school in limited ways? I don't know, but I think that we need nuance as opposed to all or nothing binary decisions. And then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the insurrection that we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. Such an interesting example of how people can be enraged to do acts that I think they probably once thought unthinkable. I would consider it to be domestic terrorism. There were people who engaged in acts of violence for the purpose of advancing a political agenda. And yet in this country, we do not have a general statute for domestic terrorism the way we do for international terrorism. Is that the right call? Now, maybe it is, because to have a general crime of domestic terrorism, I think will open us to more cases of using sting operations and informants and surveillance on our own citizens. We already do that for certain kinds of crimes. And it may be that there is a charge of seditious conspiracy that's available even here. But I've confronted issues of dangerous, violent domestic groups. And I know that sometimes I felt like my hands were tied in terms of the charges and investigative techniques that were available to me because they were domestic groups. Certainly, we hold dear our First Amendment rights of free speech and free assembly. And I think we would have to think about drawing our balance of those things to respect those constitutional fundamental rights of Americans in different places. And that's a debate that we should have, but we should have it in a way that is nuanced, that respects the nuance, and not in a way that is colored by our views about what happened on Capitol Hill that day. I think it was atrocious. And there are others who will say they were protecting their country against overreach and zealots. I think we need to free ourselves from those political constraints and have a real debate on the law, on how do we keep our country safe while also protecting our civil liberties. And the only way to do that in a rigorous way is by seeing those shades of gray and respecting those shades of gray, and not thinking that everyone who advocates on a particular side is either on the red side or the blue side. I mean, it's become like Michigan versus Ohio State, right? You're either on my team or your team. Let's respect the shades of gray that come in between. And I think only by doing that and having that rigor and that discipline can we truly be the kind of country that is moving toward a more perfect union. So I'm going to stop there because I'd really rather engage with all of you and answer your questions and talk about what's on your mind.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. The question of nuance is very dear to my heart, and I spend a lot of time thinking about it because, of course, in media, there are all sorts of incentives, especially from the social media platforms, to drop the nuance and give the hot take. And audiences are more and more used to that, and media has a huge role to play in this. But the breadth of your expertise is so broad, I'm having a hard time choosing from the many smart questions that you have. So I'm going to zero in on something you said around judges. And we have a question here that says, as you say, judges have become politicized. The conversation around them has become politicized. And it makes it hard for me to trust Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett. What are your feelings about these judges? And do you think that they will operate in a partisan, in a partisan way, given the era in which they were nominated?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that those two in particular made some very serious mistakes that contributed to the perception that you have, Lee. And I think that judges need to know not only that they will be fair, and I'll bet if you asked them, they truly believe they are being fair, and maybe they are and will be fair. But I also think that one of the things that I always learned as a prosecutor, it was also really important to have the perception of fairness and to project the perception of fairness. And that's why in the U.S. Attorney's offices at the Department of Justice, we were required to recuse ourselves, even if there would be a perception that you had some sort of partiality or some sort of connection that would make you unfair. And so I think Brett Kavanaugh made a really serious mistake during his confirmation hearing when he talked about Hillary Clinton and about how this was all a smear job. by the Clintons designed to, impute his reputation. I think that that was a mistake because it suggested that he saw himself on the red team. And it makes everybody who sees themselves on the blue team think that he cannot be fair whenever there is a question that comes before the court that is advanced by liberal groups, the Democratic Party, or others aligned with that. And I think that was a serious mistake. I think it's going to take him a long time to recover from that. Even if he is genuinely fair in his decisions, I think we're going to need a track record of that before people believe that. So I think he made a serious mistake there. I'm hopeful that over time his decisions will be fair and will be based on fact and law and not on party. But I think by making that very high profile statement, he impugned his own integrity. I think Amy Coney Barrett also made a very serious mistake when she appeared with President Trump at the White House, both for the announcement event. I guess that's a fairly common thing, but during COVID to do it unmasked in violation of the laws of the District of Columbia, I think showed a willingness to adhere to President Trump's political agenda in a way that was damaging. And even if that was a forgivable mistake, because there is a long tradition of a president introducing his nominee to the court, I think she magnified that mistake by showing up after she was confirmed at the White House on that balcony waving with him. I think he used her as a campaign prop, and I think allowing herself to be used as a campaign prop in that way, again, created that perception that she was a Trump justice and not just a justice of the Supreme Court. I think once she was confirmed, she should have avoided being used in that way. Now, again, I hope that over time, her decisions will be based on law and fact and not politics, and that we can develop trust in her. She's already ruled in some cases in ways, so has Justice Kavanaugh, that were not aligned with President Trump. The direct filing from the Texas Attorney General to try to attack the election results in Pennsylvania. And so those kinds of things, I think over time can go a long way toward restoring that trust. But I think judges and justices really have to think twice about where they speak, what they do, who they appear with, where they appear, to avoid being used as political props.
Well, we're on the topic of the court. Biden was in the uncomfortable position in the middle of the election of being asked if he would expand the court or consider that. Do you think that's at all on the table for him?
It sounds like not. He has said that he was not looking at that. I know he seemed like he dodged it mostly. And I certainly have no inside information. But it may be that that is a bridge too far. I don't know. Democrats now have the Senate. And so he probably could do that. I think that for most of us, 9 justices seems sacrosanct, that how could you ever do that? But if you look at the history, the size of the court has actually changed over time and evolved over time. And so if you look at the big picture, I think our egocentric views of the world tend to kind of see the world in these, all my life it's been this way and it'll always be that way. But if you look at the history of the United States, it has not always been that way. And so I don't know that it would be such a big deal to expand the court, but it seems like perhaps a more politically tenable thing to do would be to expand the courts of appeals. I think they're far less high profile, and so there would be less political outrage perhaps about changing it, political pushback. People who are not lawyers don't see much about the courts of appeals, but those of us who are lawyers know just how important those courts of appeals are. And if you were to add a few seats to all of them, the Second Circuit, the Sixth Circuit, the Ninth Circuit, the First Circuit, all of them, I think he could have a real influence on the courts in a way that's maybe a little less politically tricky, but has a real impact. They certainly hear far more cases than the Supreme Court hears, and they are very influential in developing policy. For that matter, the district courts, far more people have their case heard in district court than in courts of appeal. And so I think that that might be a place that is a little lower profile, but where we might see a little more action in expansion.
Interesting. We have many questions about the potential for investigations into Trump and the ongoing investigations, I'll just sort of summarize and ask a few. One from Gina Parlavecchio: in the wake of the Capitol riots, do you think a Garland DOJ will consider pursuing a criminal investigation of Trump or his associates who made statements that were encouraged or could have been seen to be encouraging the incident? And then sort of as a 1B from Howard Kramer: what is the likelihood that the new DOJ will investigate Trump and his associates and his sons for potential crimes related to the Ukraine call?
Yeah, great question. So I certainly have no facts other than pure speculation about both of these things. So with regard to the insurrection, or whatever it is we're going to call it, and I think names are important, and I would be curious to see, Heather, you're in the media. I don't know what you're calling it these days. What do you call it?
It's been shifting. At first it was riots. I'd say it has shifted to insurrection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it is the kind of thing where history may give us, a little distance to tell us. Right now, I know I've been calling it the events of January 6th because it reminds me a little bit of 9/11. I think we landed on 9/11 just because it was so horrific. It had multiple locations. It kind of defies description that we just call it 9/11 because we don't know what to call it, right? And I wonder if January 6th will end up being one of those 9/11 type moments. But I think insurrection is a good a word as any when you've got people fighting against their own government in an effort to stop the certification of an elected president. So insurrection's as good as any. I think charges could be very challenging. There is a crime of the two crimes that are potentially appropriate. One is called seditious conspiracy, and then there's another one called inciting insurrection. And I think both of them, the conduct of the president in both of those incidents may be there, but I think they're both going to come down to what was his intent. And of course, proving his intent, which can be really challenging in any criminal case. But even though I know there's a lot of videos out there showing that those who actually engaged in the violence felt like they were carrying out his wishes. I'm just doing what my president has asked me to do. I am here to fight for Trump. That's what we're doing. But I think you'd have to prove his intent. We have his public remarks, certainly. And I think if one were to investigate, you would want to look at his private remarks as well. There's been some reporting that there was a meeting at the Trump International Hotel the night before with some of his family members. I mean, was this an agreement, conspiracy, to persuade these people to actually physically go into the Capitol and engage in violence and stop this count? If you can prove that, I think that that's a crime that ought to be considered for charging. However, President Trump is often, I don't know if he's careful or he's just so sloppy he gets lucky, but he also included things like, and we're going to be very peaceful. This is going to be a peaceful protest. So in addition to saying you have to fight and you have to be very strong and we're going to march down to the Capitol, he didn't say, and you're going to break down the doors and go in and stop that. He was, I think his defense would be, this was a fiery political speech. And so I think it can be challenging. And so the first part prosecutors will look at is, can we charge? Do we think we have the evidence? So you would look at not only his public, but his private comments. What was he saying to supporters? You would have to investigate. You would have to interview or put people before the grand jury to find out what his statements were privately by people who heard them. And then there's this question: just because you can charge someone, you have probable cause that a crime has been committed. Then the harder question that the Department of Justice looks at is, should you charge them? Does this advance a substantial federal interest? And you have to look at a number of things like, are there collateral consequences? Will this have negative effects on free speech? Are there potential defenses? Are there other ways of addressing this problem short of criminal prosecution, which should be sort of a last resort? Impeachment might decide whether there are criminal charges. If he has been impeached, will he be convicted at his Senate trial? And is that sufficient to hold him accountable for these actions? Those are some things. So, and is there a First Amendment defense? If I were to wager, just between us, I would say charges will not be filed for this against Donald Trump, based on what we know publicly so far, his public comments. I think the peaceful protest is likely to win as a defense that I didn't really expect or intend for these people to do this. They got out of control. Yes, I wanted them to protest. I thought at most they would do some civil disobedience. I never imagined they would engage in violence in this way. We'll see. The other one is the question about the Ukraine. Again, can you charge? I think you can. There is a bribery statute, an extortion statute that says demanding a thing of value in exchange for the performance of an official act constitutes bribery. And I think you could characterize what he did there as exactly that. His official act was this release of military aid, and the thing of value that he was demanding was the announcement. Remember, he didn't even care about the investigation itself, but just an announcement that Ukraine was investigating Hunter Biden in an effort to smear his likely opponent, Joe Biden. So I think you could technically make out a claim for that. Then the harder question always, should one charge this? And I think that there is some case law out there by the recent Supreme Court in the McDonald case, the case out of Virginia, the Bridgegate case out of New Jersey, the Skilling case out of Enron, where the Supreme Court has really chipped away at a lot of the public corruption charges, saying, you know, everything that is slimy and unethical does not necessarily make it criminal. Presidents, you know, play hardball all the time. They use tough negotiating tactics, and we don't want to criminalize everything that is there. I still think that this surpasses those legal standards because it was an official act and it was designed to give him a personal benefit, not a benefit for the good of the country. This wasn't negotiating as the president to advance a national interest. It was negotiating as candidate Donald Trump to elicit a personal interest. So the should we question, I think, is just much harder in terms of whether this is something that we should allow the political process to take care of. And perhaps one could argue that it did in his election loss, versus should this be a crime for which people are held accountable? I also think we have to think about, does every former president get investigated and prosecuted by his successor? That being said, I think this was a very egregious abuse of power. I think it is one for which impeachment was appropriate. And I think the failure to convict him in the Senate was a missed opportunity to hold a president accountable in a way that was appropriate.
Interesting. I really agree with you on the first piece of that. When you look at the transcript of exactly what he said in the speech leading up to the march, I agree. I don't know if he was careful or lucky, but he didn't quite get there. Yep. And I think that's probably a gaping hole.
Rudy Giuliani, though, what do you think? He might be in more trouble. He said we need to engage in trial by combat. That might be he might be on a shakier ground there.
I think he was a lot sloppier, and I think that's right. So since we were talking about elections and the related insurrection, I just want to shift gears to a question directly around voting rights. And this is from Bonnie Hecht, who asks, what kind of chance do you feel there would be for the new Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which seems crucial to having free and fair elections as we go forward? What do you feel would be the best ways for citizens to help with such passage, given that our elected officials may not be the politicians that most need to be influenced?
Well, again, not based on anything that I know or inside information, but just pure speculation. I think right now there is an opportunity, just because Democrats control the House and the Senate and the White House, and it's rare that those three things align. I think one observation I would have from the Obama administration is, in his first 2 years, he did have that alignment. He used it to push the Affordable Care Act and got it, and then never had it again and lost the window to do other kinds of things legislatively. And so it seems that Joe Biden needs to pick his spots. Right now, it seems that he is using COVID relief, as President Obama used. Remember, the economy was tanking at that time, and used an opportunity to do financial reform. And so COVID relief is going to have to come first, I think. But after that, he can really pick his legislative agenda, and he may lose this majority in 2 years when we have midterm elections. So I think he needs to strike. This seems like a really important one, because if you can reform voting rights, then you may be able to also have majorities in the House and Senate to advance other aspects of your legislative agenda. And it isn't about rigging the system, I think. It's about unrigging the system. We've seen, since the voting rights was sort of gutted with the Shelby County decision in 2012, we have seen states pop up all over the place with gerrymandering and laws that make it more difficult to vote by putting obstacles in the way, like photo IDs and other kinds of laws that are, more cleverly designed efforts, I believe, to suppress the votes of minorities and young people and others who might be more transient. And it is having the effect of the minority in the country, those in red states and red communities, controlling and dictating the makeup of the legislatures in states and in the House. And so I think if I were advising Joe Biden politically, I might suggest to him that not only is this important to empower voters and make sure that we all have the right to vote, but if he wants to advance other parts of his legislative agenda, then making sure that he has fair representation, people have the right to vote, is one of the first orders of business, is critically important.
While we're on the topic of civil rights in general, I will pass along a question from Philip Filari, who asks, are there any changes in the focus of the Civil Rights Division Housing Discrimination Unit that you envision coming?
Yeah, I don't know in particular about that part of it, but I do know that during the Trump administration, the Civil Rights Division was somewhat dormant and was not actively and aggressively pursuing a lot of civil rights cases. And so I would expect that we will see a renewed focus there. Kristen Clark has been nominated to head the Civil Rights Division, and I know her to be, she's a former trial attorney in that group. I think she will be very focused on cases and bringing cases. And I know from my own work at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we created a civil rights unit at my former office, and I expected there to be a lot of action in criminal cases. And to my surprise, the action all came in civil cases. And there was so much work that I had previously been oblivious to. We got a lot of referrals from the fair housing organizations in the state of Michigan. And we found so many cases of housing discrimination. And one of the things that the Department of Justice can do when it wants to is it has a testing program where it sends in, when it gets reports and complaints about discrimination in housing, it can send in undercover individuals to do testing. So for example, right here in Ann Arbor, at an apartment complex, we had reports from a number of people who were of color seeking to become tenants of those apartments, who complained that the sign out front said, now leasing. And when we got there, they would always say the apartment was just rented. And so the Department of Justice will send in pairs, testing pairs. One will be Black and one will be white, and they will have similar identities. They will say, I'm 32 years old and single, I work in a bank, and I make $65,000 a year. And in this particular apartment complex in Ann Arbor, we sent in 40 pairs. And in all 40 pairs, 40 out of 40, the white tenant was offered the apartment and the Black prospective tenant was denied and told that the apartment had just been released, even though everything else about them was identical. And so they aren't crimes, they're violations of civil rights laws, go on all over the country all the time in quiet ways that I think most of us are oblivious to. And I expect that work will resume with vigor in the new administration. And not only do the victims of that discrimination get damages, but those apartment complexes and houses and others are required to change their policies to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. So every one of those cases represents exponentially larger numbers of people whose rights will be enforced going forward.
And also on the topic of civil rights and related to COVID, do you have a perspective on prisons at this time, in that should they release nonviolent offenders until the pandemic is over? And similarly, should prisoners get the vaccine as soon as residents of other institutions? And this question comes from Rich Charlton.
Yeah, those are really important policy questions. I don't know if I know the answer about the vaccine and prioritizing, but I think we should think of them as, they are fellow citizens who are institutionalized. They did not receive the death penalty, other than a small few. They have been convicted of crimes ranging from the very serious to not serious at all, a failure to pay fines and fees. And so I think we need to think about if we're going to confine their ability to be safe and socially distant, don't we have an obligation to house them in a way that is safe? And I think the answer to that is yes. So does that require release? I don't know. There are many prisons where they have restricted visits, and there have been no outbreaks of COVID. And so I think in those kinds of places, perhaps watching with care and making sure that safe standards are in place to prevent them from exposure. In places where there have been outbreaks, that is where we're seeing release of people. There have been people released to home confinement who are confined to places. And then the interesting question is, should they be furloughed or returned? I don't know that you need to release Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen just because they happen to be in a facility where there's a COVID outbreak. You can send them home, and then when everybody can be vaccinated in the summer, I think they should go back. They have committed a crime. We don't want them to be unsafe and exposed to the virus in an environment where they can't be socially distanced. But I don't know that means you get the windfall of being released forever. I think you should have to come back. I think for those who have complied with the law while they're on release, maybe they can stay released if they were being sentenced because they were deemed a danger to the community. But don't forget, a big part of incarceration is deterrence. And so for people like Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen, they're not locked up because they're dangerous. They're locked up because we want to deter people from engaging in fraud. And we want to let people know that the rule of law matters. And if you violate it, you'll be held accountable.
Great. So I'll shift gears. I have several questions here about the reputational effects of various government divisions from the Trump years. And I'll pick Rachel Postman's in particular. She asks, how deeply damaged do you think the reputation of the DOJ has been by the conduct of the US attorneys general during the last 4 years? And how do you think it can be repaired? And how long do you think it will take to do that? And a few other people have asked, do you think it's possible to get really high quality attorneys in these roles again?
That's a question that worries me very much because I think that the Department of Justice is really different from other cabinet departments in that it must be seen as apolitical. It must be seen as advancing the rule of law in a way that is independent and with integrity. And I do think that Attorney General Barr in particular really damaged the reputation of the Department of Justice. I think he did that by first giving a very misleading representation of what was contained in Robert Mueller's report about the Russia investigation and the ties to the Trump campaign. Even Robert Mueller himself sent him a letter saying the way you've represented it has been very misleading to the public. I think he also did that through his dismissal of the charges against Michael Flynn in an incredibly tortured representation of that his lies to the FBI were not material. That is not a position the department takes in any other case. And I think that being so disingenuous there, causing lawyers to walk off the case, was very damaging to the department. And then the third example, I think, was his interference in the sentencing of Roger Stone. Certainly as the Attorney General, he has the ability to overrule a decision of a line prosecutor in any case. But the only time he chose to do that was in a case when it involved the president's allies. And so I think in those cases, those should have been the last cases where he intervened, because as we talked about before, it isn't just fairness, it's also the appearance of fairness and the perception of fairness. And by weighing in and cutting a break to those people who are allies of the president, I think William Barr gave the impression that when you are connected to the president, there's one set of rules and a different set for everybody else. So I think that's been very damaging to the Department of Justice. There were also U.S. attorneys who participated in those recommendations. A U.S. attorney in Pennsylvania who participated in announcing that some ballots had been found opened at a clerk's office, a secretary, or at a clerk's office, and suggesting that they all had voted for President Trump, in some ways suggesting and contributing to President Trump's narrative that the election was rigged. I think all of those things were incredibly harmful. And can they be repaired? I think it's going to be a big step. I also think that President Trump severely harmed the FBI by talking about how it was in tatters and it was the Russia hoax and the witch hunt. And I think that is very damaging when you think about the FBI out in the community in rural parts of America, when they're knocking on doors, asking for help in kidnapping cases, and bank robbery cases and sex trafficking cases, I think members of the public are far less likely to open the door and talk with them. When they are jurors on cases, I think they're far less likely to believe the testimony of an FBI agent now that their president has told them that they are witch hunters who engage in hoaxes. So I think all of that has been very damaging. So I think there's work to be done. I hope that Attorney General Merrick Garland, if and when he is confirmed, will understand this. I am heartened by his comments when he was nominated, that he said his top priority is to make sure America understands that there is not one set of rules for Democrats and another for Republicans, that the rule of law has to be applied even-handedly and fairly. And so I am confident that will be his priority, and I hope he's successful. But I think it's an uphill battle to make sure people realize that. And can the Department of Justice attract good people? I hope so, and I think so. As I said, I was involved in the transition, so I've seen some of the people who are applying to join the department, and they're fantastic. Many people who are alumni of the department, and many young people. I know I have many students who want to work there this summer in jobs, both in Washington at Main Justice and out in U.S. attorneys' offices. So I do think that we can attract good people to work there. And I think by doing that, that will help to restore justice, or the perception of justice. But I think time will tell. I think we need to make sure that the election of Joe Biden doesn't just mean, well, now the Democrats are in office and they get to put their thumb on the scale for all the Democrats. I think that they have to see an even-handed application of the rule of law. And over time, I hope that people's trust will be restored.
We have a lot of related questions as to the reputational effects of the office of the presidency, and whether there can be rules in place, to sort of manage the ethics of nominees and discover them. Someone in particular asks, are there any executive orders that Biden can put in place? For example, all presidential candidates must release all tax returns, or do these types of rules typically have to go through Congress?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There's an excellent book on all of this called After Trump, written by Bob Bauer, who was a former White House counsel to President Obama, and Jack Goldsmith, who was a DOJ official in the Bush administration, Bush 43. And they come up with a series of recommendations for reforms to restore norms, codifying some things that we've always sort of taken for granted that we saw President Trump kind of flout. And one of these is this tax return thing. I don't think an executive order could be binding, because executive orders are things where Congress has given the president the ability to execute the laws and statutes. I think it would either have to come from Congress or probably from states. I think California is one. They said that if you want to be on our ballot going forward, you have to release your tax returns. And so elections are really, a collection of 50 state elections that occur on the same day to elect candidates. And so I think states, if they want to make it a legal requirement, could do that. So in other words, in Michigan or New York, if you want to be on the ballot in our state, a condition is that you have to release your tax return. So I think that would be a way to do it. I think that President Biden is probably not authorized to do that. But I think that would be one that would go a long way. The other important suggestion, I think, is requiring compliance with subpoenas by Congress. We saw President Trump really game that out by dragging out the subpoenas that he received from Congress. He challenged them in courts. He got multiple challenges. And so one of their suggestions is requiring that those be decided within a matter of days so that you can't run out the clock. President Trump still hasn't complied with all of those subpoenas that were served years ago for a lot of his records on things. And so I think making that clock a lot shorter would be a way, allowing him to challenge them, but only with very short windows to do so.
Interesting. We have time for just one more question. I saved my favorite topic for last, media. And we have a lot of questions in the same vein of restoring confidence in institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll read one from Julia Choi. Why has confidence in modern media and media channels eroded? And what advice would you give them to restore confidence and trust in them by the American people? It seems like getting the facts and circumstances published in an unbiased manner is challenging these days.
Yeah, boy, that's a really tricky one. Heather, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but I think one of the things is not only media, but social media, where the social media companies, are really just platforms where anybody can publish. And so, we saw our electorate victimized by Russians who put a lot of fake news on social media that people believed, Pizzagate, that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex slave operation in the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizza restaurant. Turns out didn't even have a basement. Are there ways to ensure that? I think it's a really tricky thing. I think the media themselves need to do a little better job of policing themselves about that which is true. I think that public education is also a big part of this. We live in a country where we really value a free press, and this long held idea that it is the marketplace of ideas, that more information is better than less information. But it also is only if that information is true. And people can abuse that freedom by exploiting it with propaganda. And I think that's something we've seen. And so I think personally, the answer lies in public education, helping people discern the difference between that which is true and that which is false. I think we've all become a lot better at understanding what is true and what is not on social media and in the press and things that we read online. But I think we have to become more skeptical. I know I saw something the other day, maybe on Twitter. Before you forward something, they will ask you, do you want to read this article before you forward it? And so I think those kinds of things, building in some discipline and rigor and responsibility to users maybe is the way to do that. But for every use, there will always be an abuse. But as long as we are equipped to recognize those things, then I think maybe we can help overcome some of the spread of misinformation. What are your thoughts, Heather?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Public education is one angle of it. I think the social platforms are another. There needs to be some adjustment of the algorithms that the social platforms use around news. They take publishers' content for free and then just feed it into their algorithms with the rest of their content. And the incentives are now completely misaligned for publishers to get viewers to their content and also get truthful and nuanced information out there. And it's up to the platforms to start trying to realign those incentives via tweaks that they make to their algorithms. And then I can't believe I'm saying this as a First Amendment lawyer, but I have come around to believe that Section 230 needs some adjustments. Platforms are right now feeling a bit frozen as to how much they can police content, based on the liability that it gives them. And I think we need to unfreeze them a bit. It looks like that's a priority for Congress on both sides of the aisle at this point.
It's all about nuance, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's why I don't personally tweet. If you look at my Twitter, there's like nothing there because you just can't get across nuance. And that's the world in which we live in. I completely agree. Well, we are out of time, Professor. I can't thank you enough. I've interviewed many people, and I don't think I've ever interviewed anyone with such breadth and depth of knowledge across so many topics. That we have so many more questions that we didn't get to here, but this was really fun for me, and I'm sure for everyone listening.
Thanks so much. It was my honor to be with all of you, and sorry we didn't get to more of your questions, but it's great to be with all of you in New York, and I hope you enjoy the snow. It's a gift.
Well, thank you so much, Professor McQuade, for leading us in an absolutely fascinating conversation. And thank you, Heather, as well, for hosting and adding your perspective. To all of our attendees, please be on the lookout for an email. We'll be asking you to fill out a brief survey so that we can get your feedback as we're planning the next Michigan and Manhattan event. And that email will also contain contact information for Sarah Michaels and me, the two of us who live and work for U of M right here in the region, in case you'd like to be in touch with us. And of course, we hope that you'll join us again for the next Michigan and Manhattan. Thank you again for attending today. Special thanks again to Barb McQuade and Heather Dietrick, and go Blue.